Providing something more than just transportation, giving driver and passengers a luxurious ride has been a long, slow process that has at last reached its climax in the 1939 Oldsmobile. Let's go back to the beginning of the industry, back to the horse and buggy days. For although the horse has disappeared, this Oldsmobile of nearly 40 years ago is built much like a buggy. Even then, Oldsmobile had laid the foundation of its enviable reputation for economy and dependability. But the engineers of that distant day were more concerned with making the car go than with riding comfort. Mounted under the car body were a pair of buggy springs. They were stiff and hard. They needed a lot of greasing, and even then they squeaked. Together, these two springs supported the weight of the engine and the body and held the axles in place. And they did support them. But meanwhile, the passengers were bobbing and bouncing about. However, they didn't mind, for weren't they wheeling along in their merry Oldsmobile? More than 30 years ago, Oldsmobile engineers turned their attention to comfort, and their first concern was with the springs. Now that the horseless carriage was looking less like a carriage and more like an automobile, the need was found for a springing system designed to suit the requirements of the new vehicle, and so 4 buggy springs replaced the original 2. Mounting the body on 4 springs instead of 2 doubled the spring area and gave twice as good a ride. However, there was still much to be desired. The rear springs could be and were longer than the front, and therefore were softer in action. Certainly using 4 springs was a great step forward. But perfection had not been attained, because the springs served as structural members holding the axles in position as well as cushioning the ride. Because of this, the ultimate in riding comfort could not be achieved. When the brakes were applied, the axles were rotated forward, affecting steering and riding comfort. This was inevitable because the spring had to absorb the stopping force. So too, when the car was started abruptly, the axles were rotated backward, causing the springs to dip, thus affecting steering and jerking the passengers back against the seats. This had to be so because the rear springs, like the front, were structural members. It was a quarter of a century before the second great advancement in springing was introduced to the industry by Oldsmobile: the substitution of coil springs for buggy springs in the front. This, in connection with knee action, immediately increased riding comfort, for at once the front springs were no longer structural members. Instead, they served only to cushion the front end. Not only were the front springs devoted now solely to the job of improving the ride, but also the relatively inefficient leaf springs were replaced by coil springs. Many are the inherent flaws in leaf springing. As the spring is depressed, the leaves move, causing friction, and increased friction means harder riding and wear, as well as the need for a lubricant. There is obviously no friction in a coil spring because no parts are rubbing together. Without friction, there is no wear. So the life of a coil spring is the life of the car. The spring rate of the leaf spring is not constant, but varies for several reasons. If too much lubricant is used, there is less resistance and more bouncing of the passengers. If cold weather hardens the lubricant, the springs are stiff and the passengers get a rough ride. If rain washes away the lubricant, there is greater friction, more wear, and annoying squeaks. As the car ages, the springs weaken to discomfort of the passengers. Not only is there no wear with coil springs, but also they are constant all the year round, regardless of temperature. There is no possibility of hardening nor washing away the lubricant because there is no lubricant, nor can there be any spring squeaks because there is no friction. We're all familiar with the useful coil spring. It presses the flint in a cigar lighter against the wheel. It closes the screen door, and it suspends the bird cage. If the automobile engineers found it worked so well on the front wheels of their cars, why didn't they put it on the rear wheels? The answer to that is that the coil spring, when under tension, is a powerful force. And when that force is not controlled, out he jumps. The action of the coil is often violent. It seems to resent all restraint. However, in expert hands, a coil spring can be so delicately controlled that it will tell the time to a split second. Oldsmobile owners were enthusiastic about the comfort provided by front coil springs. Meanwhile, Oldsmobile engineers were seeking a system that would allow the use of coil springs at the rear, a system by which 4 coil springs could be so controlled that the car would be stabilized no matter what its movement. Now, that goal has been attained, after years of experimentation and testing in the laboratory and on the road, Oldsmobile engineers developed, and now Oldsmobile proudly introduces the greatest contribution to riding comfort since knee action, Oldsmobile's exclusive quadricoil springing. Now at last, the old-fashioned buggy springs are replaced at all four wheels with strong coil springs. Spring action is uniformly soft, and passengers ride in complete comfort, winter and summer, rain or shine. No doubt about the effectiveness of coil springs. Everybody was agreed on that, and anybody could put a coil spring at each corner of an automobile. But it was Oldsmobile engineers who went the whole way and developed four-way stabilization, making possible the positive control of coil springs, which provides the superb ride in the new car. The problem was to prevent fore and aft and side-to-side movements and to control up and down and rolling movements. Fore and aft movement is prevented in the front by the V-shaped lower control arms of the knee action mechanism. They're fastened on the frame so they absorb all driving and braking forces and allow the wheels to move vertically, independently of each other, but make it impossible for them to move fore and aft. In the rear, extending from the coil spring seats on the axle forward to the frame cross-X member, are two heavy stabilizing arms, so fastened that they move up and down only and prevent any fore and aft movement. Much of the great contribution made by these stabilizing arms to Oldsmobile's amazing new ride is due to the wide spacing of the forward ends where they're attached to the frame on each side of the X-member. Much greater stability and rigidity are achieved than by fastening the forward ends together at the same point. These stabilizing arms are also sturdy members through which the car is driven. Secondly, to prevent lateral or side-to-side motion, another member is incorporated in the four-way stabilizing design. A lateral control bar is fastened to the rear axle at one end and to the frame at the other. Its function is to hold the axle in perfect alignment with the frame and the body, thus preventing any side-to-side motion. The third movement is controlled by Oldsmobile shock absorbers. Double acting, both front and rear, they are the finest and most expensive built. Double acting shock absorbers are essential to four-way stabilization. This year, the new rear shock absorbers are mounted on the axle outside the spring seats for greater stability. The arms are widely spaced to increase their efficiency as stabilizers. They extend backward and are fastened to the frame back of the rear axle, thus making possible more positive control of the up and down movement of frame and body. Finally, the fourth movement of the car that must be controlled is a rolling motion commonly experienced when the car is taking a curve. Here again, it is controlled both front and rear. When either side of the chassis tends to rise faster than the opposite side, this motion is neutralized at the front by the spring steel ride stabilizer. At the rear, the stabilizing arms prevent rolling because the arms are widely spaced where they're fastened to the frame. This method of spacing is responsible for their ability to resist the tendency of the car to roll. Now let's see what we have. At each corner of the car is a four-way stabilized, soft, flexible coil spring replacing the old-fashioned buggy spring. Now, the Oldsmobile ride is matchless, not only because the coil springs are softer, but also because it is now possible for the first time to maintain permanent balance between the front and rear springs rates. This is because coil springs have a constant rate of deflection throughout their entire travel and under all conditions, while leaf springs become stiffer the farther they are compressed because the friction area increases. Quadricoil springing overcomes another disadvantage of leaf springs. When one leaf spring is compressed more than the other, as in going over a bump, that spring is lengthened, and there is a deflection of the track of the rear wheels. This causes rear wheel steering, which can be completely overcome only with quadricoil springing. Let's review the four possible movements of the car that must be controlled if perfection in riding comfort, roadability, and safety is to be achieved. Up and down, forward and back, side to side, and rolling or swaying. How is four-way stabilizing accomplished in the new Oldsmobile so it can provide the utmost in riding comfort? 4 double-acting shock absorbers control up and down movement, support arms in the front, and the marvelous new stabilizing arms at the rear prevent forward and back and side-to-side movement. The new lateral stabilizer bar at the rear makes doubly sure that lateral or side-to-side movement is eliminated. Finally, the rolling motion is controlled by the ride stabilizer at the front and the new stabilizing arms at the rear. To add still further to the comfort and peace of mind of driver and passengers, the entire system is insulated in live rubber, so there are no metal-to-metal contacts. Road noises are smothered, so they do not reach either the frame or the body. So too, driving and braking forces are cushioned by this new use of heavy rubber insulating pads placed at each end of those marvelous stabilizing arms. Knee action, for years a dominant factor in maintaining Oldsmobile's fame as an easy riding car, now when combined with quadricoil springing and four-way stabilization, gives Oldsmobile the best ride it is possible to obtain in an automobile. Seeing is believing. It could scarcely be believed that a car could negotiate this rough road without tossing the passengers about. But let your eyes convince you how completely knee action and the new quadricoil springing system can take the bumps and never let the body know a thing about it. The engineers at the proving ground call this the roughest stretch of highway ever built to torture a car. The uneven stones of the Belgian roads simply cannot torment the passengers in the 1939 Oldsmobile, for quadricoil springing smooths away the jars and jolts, transforming this rocky road into a boulevard. Observe that when the car comes to a stop, there is no dipping movement in the front end to pitch the passengers forward. And when the car is started, there is no dipping in the rear end to jerk the passengers backward. Four-way stabilization has truly prevented fore and aft movement. Now watch it on a sharp turn. The driver hasn't slackened speed as he should, for he's trying to find out just what this car will do. And what it does is sail around that curve with never a suggestion of rolling. But even the alert eye of the camera can't see all there is to see about the rhythmic ride you get in these new Oldsmobiles. It is something to be experienced, each one for himself, something to be experienced and then to be desired. For if you want the best ride, this year, it's Oldsmobile.